tortured and slain, singing out the Most High name. How will my legacy stand inside God's Hall of Fame?
My name is Kathleen Ferrell, and I would like to invite you to step back in time with me for a few moments into the world of the early church and look into what life was like for Christians in those very challenging first centuries. And since we're studying the culture of the Roman world, we will focus on scriptures from the book of Romans. Let's read Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the tender mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For 500 years, the Roman Empire dominated the world. 1/4 of the world's population lived within the empire. What we know as the Mediterranean Sea was actually called the Roman Lake, as Rome conquered its neighbors and gobbled up their wealth and resources. Each emperor sought to enhance the empire and his own legacy through acquiring more territory and money. And the Roman world flourished in its power and in every vice that fuels and flows from greed. The lust for dominance, wealth, and self-indulgence in the culture of Rome would be a study to occupy a hospital full of psychiatrists. These are the remnants of statues built by emperors to extol their own greatness. I apologize for the tourist in the photos, but I stand there to show you the enormous size of what remains of the statues and the egos of the driven men who built them to bring glory to themselves. Loyalty, hard work, and patriotism were expected of Roman citizens, but in reality, power and greed were the motivators for every decision. It is always about money. Dominance and wealth were the real virtues of Rome. I can confidently say it would be exceedingly rare to find a Roman emperor who led a moral life or who died of natural causes. 3 firm classes existed in Roman society. Patricians, who inherited wealth and family position, and the rights and privileges of Roman law protected them. Plebeians, the working class citizens who scratched out a living as soldiers or farmers or merchants. And slaves were from every race. Most came to Rome as prisoners of war. Enslaved human beings were the backs and power of the empire. Every brick and archway built in the Roman world was cut and laid by a slave. Cheating was the way of business in the Roman economy. Every superior stole from his subordinates, and every subordinate accepted bribes and favors from both sides, and altogether they exploited the everyday man. Rome was a society of predators. This was the greatness of Rome. In the Roman world, when a child was born, the midwife set the baby on the ground. If the father picked up the child, it was accepted as his own. If not, it was to be exposed, deliberately abandoned. There were spots in each town where babies were left behind, and these locations were frequented by slave traders. Women had no legal right over their children or themselves, and Roman fathers could sell their children of any age into slavery. For the wealthy patrician, about 10% of the Romans that inherited money and status, all existed to please them in their life of luxury and privilege. Pontius Pilate would be a New Testament example of a patrician. A patrician boy was educated and cared for by a tutor, a nurse, and many slaves. He was groomed to take his place in business or politics and advance his family's status and wealth. His education was in Greek, mathematics, and the ways of indulgence, wine, women, and treachery. Patrician girls were raised in a strange double standard of homemaker values, learning to spin and sew, and yet taught to attract men loaded with makeup and outlandish hairdos and clothing. This is the wife of the Emperor Domitian. He was so paranoid of assassination, and with good reason. He had the marble of every hallway and floor polished in the Palatine Palace, so he could see any assassin who might be coming after him in the reflection. Well, in the end, his wife was part of the group that stabbed him to death in their bedroom. Roman girls were married by about 12 years old, the political and business advancement of their fathers being the only reason for their marriage. A funerary inscription of a woman named Vittoria said, married at age 11, gave birth to 6 children, died at age 27 in childbirth. A Roman mother's job was to prepare her children to become civesi Romani, or Roman citizens. Infertility was grounds for divorce. Aristocratic families wanted sons to carry on their name. Children of wealthy families were cherished and spoiled beyond imagination. But families who did not want to or could not pay for a female's dowry when she married would expose her as an infant. As females could not inherit name or property, they were useless other than as a pawn for their father through their marriage. How incredible that Jesus Christ elevates women as precious souls throughout his entire ministry. Divorce and remarriage was common practice in patrician families, many being married and divorced 5 times in their lives. Marriage for men was to acquire a money dowry from his new wife's family and enhance his social and business position. It had nothing to do with monogamy or love. Roman men and women commonly had adulterous affairs. Only legitimate heirs could inherit the family fortune, so marriage delineated who inherited what. Remember, monogamy, one husband, one wife for life, came into the world from Christian values. It was a common practice for a Roman man, whether patrician or plebeian, to lend his wife to a dinner guest for his sexual pleasures for an evening or an extended period of time. In exchange, the man might receive a desired business deal or a sum of money. In contrast, male dominance was shown by taking another's wife sexually. As Brutus and the other senators plunged their daggers into Julius Caesar, their raging anger was surely fueled by Caesar's sexual domination of their wives, and even of Brutus's own mother. Marriage laws were constantly being reformed because of problems in Roman society. One law stated that a girl's marriage was only valid as long as her father, who had arranged the marriage, lived. Well, when an increase in patricide or father killings became a problem, that law was abolished. The plebeian class were about 50% of the people in the Roman world. Think of Cornelius of the book of Acts as the best of the plebeian class. Some plebeians thrived in a trade or business, while others barely survived as sharecroppers. There was a little marriage when there was no property at stake, which left millions living their entire lives in promiscuity and fornication. Plebeians were the working class, the bakers, farmers, and soldiers. Soldiers increased their income by pillaging the territories they conquered, and there were no rules for their behavior. They were forbidden to marry, so they spent their lives fighting to keep the empire rich. Soldiers maintained order in the provinces and fought for new lands from England through the Middle East. And keeping conquered territories under control demanded a heavy hand, as once free people were now the property of the empire. Slaves, by birth, by exposure, or from being conquered, comprised about 40% of Roman society. There was no racism in slavery, though ethnic prejudice against newly imported groups like Germans was ever present. Jewish slave traders followed the Roman army to purchase the best of the new captives. This was the number one business of Roman Jews. For example, when Julius Caesar won a huge portion of Gaul, now France, in battle, 53,000 French slaves were brought back to Rome in that single campaign. The Vernae, or second-generation slaves, were the most desirable because they had been raised as slaves to be submissive and did not require as much discipline and punishment as newly acquired slaves. Here we see two slaves working in the kitchen in this rare wall painting or fresco from Pompeii. Some slaves became highly skilled in mosaic arts or metalworks, and very intelligent slaves functioned as researchers or became highly educated tutors for patrician children. But most slaves staffed the homes and provided the labor of the empire, working throughout their lives at whatever was chosen for them, with no laws to protect them. Slavery, by its nature, was filled with cruelty and abuse. Slaves were considered to be inferior beings, spoken to in terms used for pets and children, and regardless of their age, referred to as little boy or little girl. Cutesy pet names were given to them, like we would use for Rover or Tinkerbell for our animals. This mosaic shows slaves wearing masks and entertaining at a party. A prosperous master would rejoice at his slaves breeding, like a rancher with his herd of cattle increasing. Marriage was illegal for slaves. Enslaved women were the lowest of all society. A slave woman was used and abused by every man of the home throughout her life. Because of this, slave women were frequently the victims of their mistress's anger. A journal entry records that one mistress beat her slave to death because she did not curl the mistress's hair properly. Slave women bore children from whoever sired them and had no choice as to their destiny. A kindly master might keep a slave child that he sired as one keeps a favorite pet and dress them up in character costumes for entertaining. It was the slave master's choice to raise his slave children or expose them as one might drown unwanted kittens. Slave traders picked up babies from pagan temples or dumps and provided a steady stream of girls to be raised for work or prostitution. Ruins of the Roman Empire are found in every country of Europe. I have eaten lunch sitting on Hadrian's Wall in northern England, imagining the soldiers fighting in the fortress, and walked through a Roman bath in Germany. It is amazing to stand where the empire has been 2,000 years before. But as civilizations grow, men tear them down and destroy what has gone before them, except for one city. To understand the daily life of the Roman Empire and the men and women who inhabited it, we look to Pompeii, with peaceful Mount Vesuvius in the background. Nowhere on earth can you go to see a 2,000-year-old moment frozen, a day in time, August 24th, 79 AD. 20,000 people lived in the city of Pompeii, yet no Latin word existed for volcano. So as Mount Vesuvius began to rumble, not all people left Pompeii, even though they were right at the base of the mountain. Because the volcano had not erupted in their recorded history, they could not comprehend what was about to happen. These are plaster casts of real human beings who were trapped in the eruption. As bodies decomposed in the hardening ash, they left a perfect mold in which archaeologists injected plaster to reveal exact replicas of the humans who died there. Perhaps these folks remained to guard their property from looting. Some died clutching little bags of gold, guarding their riches with their last breath in a 13-minute surge of poisonous gas and ash. Some huddled together with their little idol gods in their hands and tried to flee with things they thought were precious, gasping as hot gas and soot made wet cement in their lungs. Perhaps up to 5,000 souls suffocated and were petrified in time beneath 9 feet of hardened volcanic debris, leaving us a precious time capsule ready for opening. As you walk the streets, you see frozen in time a day in the life of the Roman world, immortalized in concrete for 2,000 years. All of a sudden, the history of the empire is in color, and you see beautifully frescoed walls preserved. There are roads where chariots rolled, and you can tell this is a two-way road because the stepping stones are sized for 2 lanes of chariots. The streets were filled with sludge and sewage, so these pedestrian crossing stones were very important bridges to get across the muck. And you can see how chariot wheels fit over the stone pedestrian steps, and even where chariot wheels have ground down the stone on this one-way road. An acoustically designed Roman amphitheater shows the high importance of the arts in this culture. And an early version of a buffet restaurant called a tavola calda, or hot table, can be found in each of the neighborhoods of the city. These tables would be heated below and great pots of food served from each of these buffet stations. You can almost smell the warm bread from this bakery with its great ovens and grinders, and this 2,000-year-old amazing fresco of the plebeian baker and his wife once adorned the walls of their shop. It is so rare and famous. It is used all over the world to decorate books and logos. As you look into their eyes, you see them poised for service. The woman paused with a stylus at her lips that would have worked numbers into the wax tablet she is holding. This portrait is from the wall of their bakery and would have been their advertising logo. In this fresco, you see a couple ready to take your order, ready for work. As you walk along the exact streets with the exact stones where people walked on that last day, oops, there's that annoying tourist again. You walk into the homes just as they were left and see utensils as smooth as if they were used yesterday. This beautiful courtyard stands just as it was when the mistress walked the hallways. This famous fresco of a beautiful young girl pensive before writing down a delicate thought, and family life of the wealthy at play. What we learn from Pompeii is what the priorities were of these typical people. You could see this family making music together. This is a rare fresco of an aging man with his daughters. The elderly were not generally honored in Roman society, so this painting is unusual indeed. There were 20 to 30 brothels or houses of prostitution within this city of 20,000 inhabitants. Actually, there are so many buildings excavated with pornography painted on the walls, it's hard for archaeologists to determine exactly how many are true brothels. I must admit to feeling very sad as I peek through the doors of this house of prostitution. To think of the young slave girls who gave their entire lives here, dying young of sexually transmitted disease with no choice, making money for some greedy man. This brothel was located next to the laundry, as it was thought that boiling the sheets would prevent the spread of venereal disease. The Naples Archaeological Museum, which contains all of these frescoes and the best of the Pompeii artifacts, has a special large display gallery for the lascivious paintings. Extra admission price for viewing 2,000-year-old pornography. I appreciate that it's a separate wing because I don't want to go there. And the museum curators understand what lascivious is, sensuality, and put it behind closed doors. Just because it's ancient and historical does not mean it's not pornographic. Idol worship was a part of daily life, as we see in this remnant of the Temple of Apollo. Like all things in the Roman Empire, idol worship was driven by sex, money, and control. As you enter into Pompeii, there is a street like a mini-mall lined with temples to the various gods. Idol gods were tailor-made for effect, from this gigantic goddess of Juno that filled a large temple to small household gods placed on these lararium or home altars. Some of the excavated bodies that we see in plaster molds were found crowded around these home altars, praying to their pagan gods, Jupiter or Isis, to save them. Idols were created for a market to make money. Do you remember the silversmiths in Acts 19:28 hollering, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians"? Well, here are two versions of Artemis. On the left, for a temple near Ephesus, more of an Eastern market. And on the right, created for Roman girls. There was a pocket-sized version of Artemis for girls to carry with them like a doll. Advertising and packaging were well known by idol makers. Idol worship is highly tactile and visual. The vast majority of people could not read and were struggling a living out of the dirt. So these beautiful temples and visual glories were powerful. You can see how the inventors of the Roman Catholic denomination took advantage of this tradition of having idol statues in homes and in grand cathedrals for worship. Pagan ceremonies were choreographed with fire and light displays to instill fear and awe, and to get the worshiper to give their money. Believers brought of their profits, their grain, their wares, to give to the temple to gain the favor of their chosen god. For men, you paid large sums to have sexual relations with a temple prostitute. As women were the priestesses of the temples, very large sums of money got you fornication with the temple high priestess. When the Romans conquered Bath, England, they found that the local people, the Celts, worshipped a hot spring god called Sul. Noticing the similarity to the Roman goddess Minerva and wanting to get the Celts on board, the Romans created a hybrid goddess, Minerva Sul, your Celtic idol plus my Roman idol. We can all get along. Here's what is fascinating. They excavated petrified curses at the bottom of this hot spring in Bath. As part of their worship, Romans would wish vengeance on someone for an offense and throw their curse deep into the sacred pool of Minerva. This is an actual quote from a curse found in the sacred pool. "I hope that Valerius dies the death of 1,000 bloody sores for what he has done to me." Their belief, their religion, was built on prayers of revenge. For my God to make you die because of some offense. What a new idea to the Roman world for Jesus Christ to say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Do good to those who spitefully use you. Loving and giving was not what pagan gods taught. Remember, Rome is a society of predators. The resplendent Arapaches of Augustus is a treasure of Rome. This was the high altar on which large animals were sacrificed. The blood actually poured down these steps to appease the fake deity. Well, remember Romans 12, verse 1? Present your bodies a living sacrifice. You see, Romans had all seen a living sacrifice go from life to death right before their eyes. Maybe even understanding this metaphor better than we do. Caesar Augustus himself inaugurated this altar and presided over the sacrifice. You can see the boar and the ram and the oxen lined up for sacrificing. Italians have enclosed the Arapaches in this huge glass building. It's beautiful, but rather disturbing when you realize what is being celebrated here. Lust for entertainment was deep in the Roman world, and that entertainment meant bloodshed. At the races, in the circus, or in combat in the Colosseum. And every decent Roman town had its own Colosseum. When the Emperor Vespasian destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, 20,000 Jews were brought to Rome in chains as slave labor to build the great Colosseum. The Colosseum was financed by the looting of the Temple of Jerusalem, as shown here in the Arch of Titus Justus that stands right next to the Colosseum. And this is documented on the Colosseum walls. The nail holes revealing the writing that used to say, "Built by the spoils of the Jewish war." Every stone of this structure was cut, fitted, and paid for by the sacking of the Temple of Jerusalem. Vespasian had become emperor after a bloody civil war, and he needed the support of the people. So he built the Colosseum to keep the Romans happy in their lust for entertainment. On the opening day of the Games in 80 AD, so that's 10 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, 50,000 people gathered, and hundreds of criminals fought to the death as a warm-up to the professional gladiator fights to come. Savage tigers tore men apart as human and animal blood ran 12 inches deep in the sand. Writers comment on the sheer volume of noise from the cheering in hopes that one man would die over another. Like most of the ancient world, this was all about money, gambling, power, lust, feeling of victory. The emperor was sending a clear message. Life is a battle, and Rome always wins. As the Colosseum's sole purpose was to win support of the people, and the people obtained pleasure by watching death and suffering, human death was the highest entertainment. Lions and tigers were trained to eat people. The big cats were fed human flesh so that they would learn to like the taste of it. This cell in the second tier of the Roman Colosseum has Christian messages scrawled on the wall. It is likely that Christians were held here before being brought into the arena. Animals would be placed in the cell first for several days so that when the humans were imprisoned there, they would pick up the animal's scent on their clothing and smell more enticing to the large cats, to whom they would be prey. Jailers would use long trident pitchforks to stab at the Christians and make them bloody, also increasing the animal's interest. Gladiators were the superstars of the ancient world. They were trained in schools to fight and combine showmanship with fighting technique for the pleasure of their audience. Sworn by oath to die bravely, the more wild and violent the battle of ripping each other to shreds, the better entertainment value. Gladiators often wore masks to impersonate Jupiter or Neptune and imitate this god taking vengeance on some barbarian. Winning one bout would equal a Roman soldier's salary for a year. There was a special women's section high in the arena. Roman women became obsessed with gladiator superstars and paid large sums to be with men sexually who might die in the arena the next day. At home parties of the wealthy, gladiators were frequently hired to fight to the death to entertain the guests. The pagan writer Seneca wrote, "Rome was a cesspool of iniquity." Let me translate that. Rome was a sewer of sin. And that's a pagan's opinion. So imagine you lived in the year 100 AD and you go with another woman to a late night meeting of Christians in someone's home. You hear about the love of God and you make the choice to obey as Paul or Cornelius or Lydia did and be baptized and change your life. How then do you survive daily living? You have to come out of the waters of baptism and return to your life, to a master who abuses you, a mistress who beats you, to long hours of service and sleeping on a stone floor. And you hear Paul's letter read, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Transformed. We must undergo dramatic change of our innermost personality. The inner woman must be changed from self-centered to Christ-centered. The mind of Christ is now available to us, and we may offer every breath, every action, every word unto God. But how do I transform when I have no power, no control over my life? What is the purpose of me being here when all I do is work? Well, that spiritual worship, spiritual service means take everything that you do, the dishwashing and the scrubbing and the everyday life, the working and the serving, and do it to the glory of God. Look down to Romans 12, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. I think about an enslaved man in a congregation, now leading a prayer or worshiping next to a patrician on an equal plane as Christians. Look at verse 17. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." To the contrary, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is a huge contrast in a world where people prayed for their idol gods to exact vengeance on their enemies. And here's the evidence. The early Christians really did it. The writings of the era show it. The church in Rome exploded. There's evidence of more than 25 tutuli, or congregations that met in homes in Rome. By the year 150 AD, there were an estimated 15,000 Christians in Rome. And by AD 250, 30,000. Guess how many there are now? The Lord's church has about 30 members. We had to take the metro and 2 buses to get there, as it's way out in the northeast corner of the city. But oh, how those brothers and sisters sing from the heart. One of the brothers told us that many of the brethren endure significant persecution from their families and employers because they are not Roman Catholic. The early Christians of the Roman world wanted to be different from the people around them. They did not want to blend in. Are we ashamed to be different? The evidence from the writings of this era is they obeyed the teachings of Jesus and the apostles literally. When they worshiped, they had a lesson and read the Old Testament and the letters of the apostles along with the Gospels. They had the Lord's Supper and they sang, and with their sincere faith, they converted people to Christ. One pagan Roman wrote about Christians. They abstain from all pleasures, and they do not attend sporting events and have no interest in public amusements. They reject the public banquets and abhor the sacred games. Roman Christians were surrounded with every combination of human filth. And just by studying the words of Jesus, transforming their hearts, they changed. They turned their lives to breathe in and out for the Lord. They stood out as being different. Do we stand out with our devotion to God? The early Christians embraced lives that went against Roman culture instead of following it. Justin Martyr in 150 AD wrote, "We who used to value the acquisition of wealth and possessions more than anything else, now bring what we have into a common fund and share it with anyone who needs it. We used to hate and destroy one another and refuse to associate with people of another race or country. Now, because of Christ, we live together with such people and pray for our enemies." When plague swept through the ancient world in the 3rd century, Eusebius reports that Christians were the only ones who cared for the sick. While pagans were throwing infected family members into the streets to protect themselves from the disease, Christians took them in and cared for them. Romans 12, verse 1, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. What your bodies do, sacrificial living or dying, is service to God. It's no wonder that Christianity spread rapidly through the ancient world without any technology. The love that the Christians practiced drew the attention of the world, just as Jesus said it would. They acted differently. They dressed differently. Clement of Alexandria comments in 210 AD, "Luxurious clothing that adheres to the flesh. Such clothing is meant for looking, not for covering." Wow, in the year 210. But the church emphasized principles of simple, modest dress and left the specifics up to the individual Christian. Christians avoided the public baths that were so much a part of Roman culture and taught that men and women should not dress immodestly in each other's presence. Tertullian of Carthage in 200 AD wrote about vile language and attitudes. How can it be right to look at things that are wrong to do? How can those things which defile a man when they go out of his mouth not defile him when going in through his eyes and his ears? And Tertullian did not even have the internet beaming into his home. It's just hard for me to fathom the times that these Christians lived in, for persecutions came in waves at the whim of emperors. And in part 2 of this lesson, we'll learn more of the extent to which Christians gave their whole lives to the Lord.